Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail Part 22. The Dunkirk-Calais area was easy to spot as we flew in from our forward base, the whole area being shrouded in smoke and fog. We would approach at about 800 meters and search for the fighters which would be attacking the Stukas and their escorts. We would circle the area but found it hard to engage the British as they pressed home their attacks on the bombers with great determination. Kühle seemed to hold back a lot as well, only giving the order to attack when the odds were very much in our favor. We would argue a lot about these tactics, but his opinion was firm. He would only order us in when there was a good chance of success, with as little chance of losses as possible. In that way, we argued, we would gain experience without losing pilots. That was a good and mature policy, but most of us wanted just to get stuck in, to test ourselves and to claim a victory. We had been waiting on the sidelines for too long. For the time being, we had to be content with strafing freight trains and military convoys. This relieved some of the tension and was of some military value, but it didn't make up for the lack of success in the air. As we wheeled around the dark cloud over Dunkirk, Kühle cautioned us to stay well clear of its sinister billows. If you wanted surprises, he warned, there were plenty scudding around the edges of that forbidden mass. After each mission, we would return intact, but without anything to celebrate other than that. Our second squadron had one victory, and that led to some good-natured banter in the officers' mess. On the 26th, the weather deteriorated, and although we tried to get through there seemed to be no way. In the evening, things seemed to be improving, and Oberleutnant Lommel, another veteran of the Condor Legion, led the first squadron out at 1850. Like the closing of a great door behind them, the weather closed in. Forecasting, like so many other things which we take for granted today, was still in its infancy, and they had not been able to predict the sudden change. On the radio, we could hear the traffic between the fighters as they tried desperately to find their way back to base. In the end, they had to belly land one by one in Belgium and Holland. If we'd had just a little more encouragement with our direction-finding experiments, we might have been able to talk them back. There was never any official confirmation of incidents like this. It was only speculation and rumor. It might have been different if our own group command had been set up, but at this time, events were moving on at such a pace that it was difficult to consolidate. We got our orders from Fighter Squadron 52, and these were usually brief and to the point: fly to Dunkirk. On May the 27th, in an effort to increase efficiency and to be able to reach the battle zone more often, we landed at Cambrai, which was about halfway. Here we refueled and were able to return for a second sortie. It was a day of intense activity against the land targets and the ships that were massing off Dunkirk and Calais. Our bombers pressed home their attacks but were constantly harassed by the RAF, who inflicted substantial losses. I understand that it is a complaint of many British and French soldiers who were on the beaches there that the RAF was nowhere to be seen. Believe me, they flew to their limit. By the end of the day, the 2nd Air Corps alone had lost 23 aircraft with 64 crew missing. At the end of the day, we flew back to Charleville. Just before we left Charleville, I was witness to a horrible accident which was nothing to do with the war at all. Between flights, I was standing on the grass and my attention was attracted by the sound of an approaching D-17. He was making a normal approach for the airfield, undercarriage down, lined up on finals, ready to land. Then I heard the approach of another engine, but this time a 109 at full power for takeoff and from the opposite direction. There was nothing we could do other than hope that by some miracle they would miss each other, but it was not to be. Just as the Dornier's engines were throttled back, there came the sickening impact as the aircraft collided and wreckage scattered across the field. The 109 removed the whole cockpit of the Dornier, killing the crew instantly before breaking up and falling to earth. There were no survivors. There was no way I could have avoided being involved, but as we raced forward, the Zankas, which were the ambulances, were quicker. I had been unfortunate enough to witness several tragic deaths and their gruesome consequences, certainly enough to allay any morbid curiosity I might have felt. It was a natural reaction to run forwards immediately after the impact to see if there was any way in which the victims could be helped. But as soon as it was established that all had perished, I left the scene. Similarly, it was not my habit to photograph such tragedy, but in this case, I seem to have made an exception. Soon after the accident, it was discovered that there was another serviceable airfield a little further to the north at Laon, and on the 29th we moved there. It was a beautifully kept little airport with some French aircraft still there and plenty of fuel in the underground dumps. I went in advance of the rest of the squadrons to begin to arrange billets in a small town. Most of the menfolk had gone, either to join the army or fleeing to avoid capture. Many of the women, however, had stayed behind to protect their homes and belongings. I opted to take quarters in a house with 3 women, one quite old but 2 who were younger and quite pretty. However, I was amused to see that they had deliberately dressed in their oldest and most dowdy clothes to appear as unattractive as possible. To further dampen any interest I thought I might have had, they also introduced me to the wine cellar. One experiment with an exploding bottle of homemade champagne was enough to convince me that I was courting danger in that cellar and left it alone. Sadie, my faithful little dog, was run over by a truck here. It was a real loss for me. Understandably, the French lived in fear of us, the invaders, but my experience was that our soldiers were well behaved. Looting was punishable by summary court-martial and execution, and I heard of few instances of personal violation. Certainly, our conduct as a unit was good, with only one case of real note experienced. Kühler had heard on the grapevine that our Oberfeldwebel was looking after himself rather well. That was easy here. The pilots from the 3rd Squadron, for instance, lived together in a large private house at Pury-au-Bois. The owners had left in a hurry and most of their belongings were still in the house. It was obvious from the quality of their clothes, china, etc. that they had been very wealthy indeed. We didn't think that we had any right to touch any of these goods and everything stayed in place. However, this didn't apparently apply to the Oberfeldwebel in question. The NCOs and the black men had been billeted in houses spread around the village, and it was here that the Oberfeldwebel decided to begin his own export business. There were still trucks regularly traveling from Laon to Böblingen to exchange technical spares and bring parts up as required. On the whole, they had to run back empty, and this is where this staff sergeant saw an opening. His wife lived in Böblingen, and it was whispered to Kühler that she was taking delivery of loot from Laon. As the next trucks were preparing to leave, Kühler asked me to come along and take a look at the contents of the truck with him. There, sure enough, was a large box addressed to the NCO's wife in Böblingen. The color drained from the Oberfeldwebel's face as Kühler asked him to stay, while the box was opened to reveal a fine collection of fur coats and delicate china and glassware. There was no doubt that the Oberfeldwebel saw himself looking down the barrels of a firing squad, but Kühler took the matter into his own hands and reduced him to the rank of private on the spot. For a long-serving NCO, that was punishment indeed, but at least he had been spared a court-martial and almost certain death. On May the 31st and June the 1st, the weather changed to allow some operations to Dunkirk and the Channel. We were hopeful that we would soon see some action when, right out of the blue, we received a message to withdraw from France to protect the Leunerwerke at Merseburg and the Junkerswerke at Dessau. To say that we were disappointed didn't come anywhere near expressing adequately how we felt. After days of frustration through bad weather and the sorties which just missed contact with the enemy, we thought we were poised to support the immediate crossing of the Channel. Then came the order to withdraw. It had a devastating effect on the squadron's morale, but orders are orders. We waited for as long as we could, knowing only too well how the military machine was prone to changes of plan, but this time there was no mistake. There's little doubt that the withdrawal had been ordered because of our losses. Although not completely written off, all the aircraft of 1st Squadron were out of commission due to the forced landings a few days earlier. They could be repaired, but first they had to be recovered and transported, and there was no pool of spare aircraft. On paper, we were down to 2/3 operational strength, and so we'd been withdrawn to regroup and refit. It was just bad luck again, sheer frustration for us who wanted to test our mettle. From the edge of the Blitzkrieg to the boredom of another Sitzkrieg. An army train was made available to move the bulk of our support units. The Nachrichtenzug, being more urgently needed, would travel by air in our own transports. Our new destination was to be Zerbst near Magdeburg, and I was able to fly that in 3 stages, stopping over at Frankfurt for the night and arriving at Zerbst on June the 3rd. On the way, at Trier, the 2nd Squadron had only just landed when they were scrambled. During the takeoff, one of the 109s crashed with another, running right into it and somersaulting. Feldwebel Munz, one of our veterans from Spain, was very badly hurt and was taken to the military hospital in Trier. Another couple of losses without enemy action. Zerbst was quite well established as a Luftwaffe airfield, with everything newly built. There were hangars with plenty of space, excellent quarters for everyone, as well as a very comfortable casino. But this wasn't what we longed for. It soon became apparent that this really was a quiet zone. Nothing was expected to happen. That would have been fine if we'd really needed a rest, to recover from the rigors of combat and to repair battle damage, but we really felt that we were frauds. We had suffered only at the hands of bad weather and bad luck. We didn't feel much like heroes. Amongst the first of the packages I opened, I found quite a few of my 8mm movie films which had been processed. I staged the show in the casino to everybody's general approval. Hauptmann Ewald, who was back at temporary group commander, suggested that it would be a good idea to start a movie Kriegstagebuch, which is a war diary, to run parallel to the official written one. Having long seen the potential of movie film, I agreed and donated my first films to the starter package. I'd already shot quite a few reels, both black and white and the very early Agfa color, and we began to cut and splice these together for the record. I enjoyed the work, so it was no hardship. It also had another advantage in the short term. At that time, nobody else had done any filming in the Gruppe or really knew anything about it, so it was only natural that Ewald called upon my experience, limited as it was, when the decision was made to purchase a camera for the Gruppe. That on its own wasn't going to be an easy task because at the time, just about everything was rationed to support the war effort. I called a dealer in Stuttgart and with the help of the Stefan family managed to secure what seemed like a good buy at around 400 Reichsmarks. It was all that was available and from the price I thought it must be a good one. In the meantime, I had bought myself a second camera. Each of mine had only cost about half what we were paying for the Gruppe's camera. Now I had one that was driven by a spring and one battery-operated unit. With these two, I was able to carry on making quite good films, usually with black and white in one and, subject to availability, color in the other. Another real advantage for me was that I was to be entrusted with the task of collecting the camera from Stuttgart. This purchase had to be handled with relative confidentiality because there was no official funding for such things. For this secret mission I was given the squadron's Me-108 Typhoon 4-seater, which we had been using for conversion to the 109. This lovely little aircraft was still in its light civilian livery and gave a certain anonymity to my comings and goings. Another thing I would be able to do on the way would be to fly a mission of mercy to pick up Feldwebel Munz from the hospital in Trier and transfer him to a hospital at Göppingen near Stuttgart. His wife lived near and she would be able to tend to him instead of leaving him in what amounted to a field hospital near to the border with Luxembourg. After a flurry of last-minute telephone calls, all looked well. By coincidence, Mr. and Mrs. Stefan had to be in Trier on the 19th of June on business looking after the building of the West Wall. They said that they'd take Gretel along so we'd have a chance to be together. With my constant moves, it had been difficult for us to see each other for a while. They said they'd take care of my accommodation arrangements and it was to be the first time I'd ever stayed in a first-class hotel like this one, the Porta Nigra at Trier. It really was an eye-opener for me, all finished off by a splendid dinner, courtesy of the Stefan family, for their frontline soldier. In the morning, after farewells over breakfast, I left the opulence of the hotel for the stunning contrast of the hospital, where Munz was to be found. It really was a horror. I had no idea in what terrible circumstances I would find him. It was a new and frightening phase of war that I'd never seen before. Army casualties were lying everywhere on thin mattresses, lined up in a large hallway of the Trier monastery. Some were badly wounded, obviously in need of attention, others were plainly too far gone for any help from this world. The aspect was of pure misery and utter depression. When they saw me in my Luftwaffe officer's uniform, they really started to let out some of their pent-up anger and frustration. "To hell with you, Herr Leutnant! To hell with the whole bloody lot of you! Now we're wounded and not much use, we're on the scrap heap, and no one cares!" It was a shock to me to see how men who had been wounded fighting for their country were being left to die. The medical staff were doing all they could, but there just wasn't enough of them to go around. So many of these brave men would die here unnecessarily. It was truly sickening. With the help of one of the nurses, I found Munz way up near to the roof of the building. As soon as he recognized me, he started off, almost begging me to find a way of taking him away. "Please get me out, any way you can. They haven't enough surgeons, not enough time to care. People are dying all the time, please." I asked the nurse if there was anything I could do to help, but, as it happened, I was to have enough problems doing what I had come to do. First, I had to see a medical sergeant who asked a whole host of questions. What kind of aircraft do you have? Do you know how seriously injured Munz is? Why is he to be flown out? Wouldn't it have been better to transfer him to Göppingen by Sanitätskraftwagen? I lied through my teeth, hoping that if we could get him to the aircraft, it would be too late to turn back, and we'd have to make the best of what we'd had. I said that we could take the seats out to accommodate him comfortably. Every question led to another, but gradually I cut my way through the red tape. I knew that if I didn't get him out right away, we'd never do it. As each new question came up, I would glance at Munz and read the pleading in his eyes. I was sure that if I failed, he would die. He was in such a pathetic state. But we succeeded in overcoming the first hurdle and actually got Munz into an army ambulance and drove out to the airstrip at Trier. Fortunately, a nurse came with us. When they first saw the cramped interior of the Typhoon and realized that we could not, in fact, take out any seats, we nearly lost the day. But together we convinced them that we could make it, and they gave over to us all the pillows and duvets they had, and we managed to make up a fairly level airborne chase lounge on which Munz was as comfortable as possible beside me. It was with a great feeling of relief, tinged with sadness, that I was able to push the throttle forwards and feel the Typhoon begin to gather speed along the runway at Trier. Munz was going home, but behind us we had left all those wounded men for whom we could do nothing. A little of the glory that I youthfully saw in the campaign was left amongst those stinking rows of blood-sodden mattresses too. In just about 90 minutes, we were touching down at Göppingen, and I soon arranged for an army ambulance to take Munz on to the hospital. He was unbelievably grateful and happy. Anyone would have thought that I had walked into a burning wreck and carried him out in my arms. He was soon in a good hospital and made a full recovery, returning to the Gruppe in December of 1940. I'd found the conditions in the monastery in Trier very depressing. It was the real phase and consequence of war. In contrast to this, we had been treated as conquering heroes when we had stopped off overnight at Frankfurt on our way to Zerbst. Everybody wanted to shake us by the hand or to buy us a drink. Most of us felt a bit like frauds, however. Although we had been on many operational missions and could at any time have actually been in great danger, things had not worked out that way. That wasn't our fault. We were still anxious to fight, but inside we knew that we'd not yet really been initiated. A few months after this, we would have given a lot of thought to have been withdrawn to Zerbst for a rest, but just now, most of us just felt a bit foolish. Once settled at Zerbst, we still had to carry on the farce for the benefit of those who wanted to celebrate us. We were well prepared for that too. Our quartermaster had stocked up well in France from the supply dumps which had been abandoned by the French and British. In our canteen there were ample supplies of chocolate and sweets and every type of drink, from real Scotch whiskey to the best champagne, cognac and French wines, all things which were no longer available in Germany. Soon the word spread that we could be counted upon to be generous with our gifts, and one invitation followed another. Kühle and myself, for instance, went to have our teeth fixed and, of course, took along an appropriate offering. This was actually the first time that I'd been treated by a female dentist. But the real fun was at the open-air swimming pool at Zerbst, where we used to go in strength. We used to invade the pool as a virtually complete squadron. Pilots, mechanics, staff clerks, everyone who was free, sometimes numbering over 100 people. The pool was set in what was a small park with plenty of tables and solid benches around the pool itself. The diving boards were great too, the highest being 10 meters high, Olympic standard. We could take along whatever our hearts desired. Chocolates, a couple of bottles of champagne, or a case of wine. We truly felt like kings. We weren't mean with our spoils either. Everyone soon learned that we were there to share our good fortune, and we soon became firm favorites with the people at Zerbst. The weather was now what we could expect from summer, with plenty of sun and clear sky. The combination of the warmth of the sun, the friendly atmosphere, and a few drinks loosened us all up, but on one occasion nearly caused me to injure myself. Feeling full of bonhomie, I announced that I was going to attempt a dive from the top board. I purposefully climbed up and stood at the edge, looking down. It seemed a lot further down than it had done from the ground. But with the crowd cheering and egging me on, I couldn't do the sensible thing and come down, although I realized that I was taking on too much. Gradually I shuffled my toes up to the edge of the board, and with a sustaining thought like, if I can fall out of a 109 at 3000 meters, I can dive off this. I let my balance tilt forwards and I was off. There was a sudden rushing of air and then a blinding pain as I hit the water with my back too bent. I thought I damaged my spine, but it was okay after a while. It had been very foolish. I'd only been off of a board at that height once before at school, and then I jumped. Still, my effort was well received and an encore called for. I gracefully declined, making my way out of the water with as much dignity as I could manage. That was the signal for the others to have a go, and one after another the pilots jumped off the board, led by Hinnergwaller. I voiced my opinion to Kühle that things might get out of hand, and he agreed, bringing the capers to a stop before anyone was hurt, much to the disappointment of the crowd. Our festivities were not confined to our base in Zerbst, and we often visited other airfields which were close. On one such occasion we were having a really fine time and had been introduced to many of the people who lived at and around the base, as well as our own colleagues. Amongst these people were two really lovely young women whose husbands were still on ops in France. One of the girls was even showing off her young baby, whose father had not yet seen it. At around dusk, the telephone rang. Quite unobtrusively, a message was taken, which had to be passed on to the two women as a matter of urgency. They were taken to one side by one of the senior officers from the host airfield and told that they had just received information that both of their husbands had been killed in action. Confirmation was sought that the operative word was killed and not missing, but sadly, there was no mistake. The mood of the whole party changed instantly. Just as a sudden thunderstorm might ruin a summer day, everything became black. We tried to console the two women, but to no real avail. They both just floundered about in welter of despair, almost beating the walls, whilst they began to suffer the full gamut of human grief. Needless to say, the party soon broke up, and we all went our various ways, each reflecting on what we'd seen. More than one of us wondered how grief would take those whom we might leave behind. However, life had to go on for the living. In the 3rd Squadron, we had a new toy, and it was always good to have a diversion. In this case, we had been allocated a new Hanomag heavy tractor unit which had to be run in. Without a trailer behind it, it was just like a big truck, and both Hinak and myself had the appropriate license to drive it. Kühle gave us permission to use it, so we dutifully ran it in by making trips to Magdeburg, where the cafes and restaurants were better. We both cut splendid figures, parking our huge tractor unit outside a small cafe and dropping in for a drink and a dance. Someone had spread a rumor that I'd been killed in France, and after witnessing the problems at the party, I could well imagine how my mother had felt until I was able to confirm that I was actually okay. So I wrote her a letter. On June 17th, 1940, I wrote, "Dear Mother, what I'd really like to do most would be to beat up the dear people of Heutigsheim. What nonsense. Those 2 days must have been very bad for you when really we were doing very well. I feel healthy, just never felt so good. We have plenty of sports, even a tennis court. I bought a new racket, however, there are no balls or tennis shoes. They cannot be bought. As it looks like we might be here for a while, please send some by express post to the address at the Fliegerhorst Zerbst. Letters and packages from June 6 all received, everything else is still in transit in France or Germany. I'll get it in the end, I'm sure. The disappointment is slowly passing. After all, as soldiers, there is no other choice but obey and fulfill our duty, which I feel we have done. To predict what is to be done with us is impossible. In any case, future disappointments could not be worse, and so I know I could take it. Let's close this chapter for now. Please don't allow yourself to get upset again like last time. Should we really get involved, I will be writing immediately. A few days with no mail is meaningless. Should something happen to me, you would be informed immediately by the commandeur. Everything else is just rumor. And now, Mother, just rejoice at our victories. Who had dared to believe it could be? An extra greeting to my little sister, please, Helga. P.S. A few days ago, I received the Iron Cross, 2nd class. Both the content and layout of my letter are very reflective of my true feelings at the time. I've gone into some detail about my disappointed and given some hints as to my feelings about duty, yet, as a postscript, I mentioned that I'd been awarded the Iron Cross. That was how I saw things. I wasn't out to get decorations, I was out to prove myself by serving my country and demonstrating my value as a fighter pilot. My own personal evaluation was that I had not, at the time, done anything which I regarded as challenging. On June 28th, we lost Unteroffizier Neumann, whose aircraft was seen to dive straight into the ground without any obvious cause. Another useless loss with no contact with the enemy. Once more I had the opportunity to fly at the Typhoon because the camera dealer in Stuttgart had telephoned to let us know that he now had a good projector and screen in stock. It was agreed that these would be added to the Gruppe's inventory, and so the officers made a collection for it. Another part of the flight was to collect some of the personal belongings of our senior officers, which had, because of our movements, been left at various points around Germany. I was delighted with my new mission. I loved flying, and this would be a real challenge. The furthest point on the trip would be Liegnitz in Silesia. There I would have to collect a heavy trunk which belonged to von Pfeil and take that right across Czechoslovakia to Stuttgart. Then I would unload and make the purchases for the Gruppe and collect a few things of my own and for others. My final stop would then be Mannheim, where I would collect some luggage and then fly directly back to Zerbst. I wasn't about to ask if it was an appropriate use of a Luftwaffe aircraft or if it would be more expedient to use the normal freight services. I was looking at a real challenge, flying along over great distances with no navigation aids or radio, just a bunch of maps and my compass. It was great. Zerbst to Liegnitz was about 450 kilometers, then down to Böblingen was a lovely 630 kilometers with a flight right over historic Prague. On to Mannheim, 100 kilometers, and back to Zerbst, another 400 kilometers. In all about 1,600 kilometers, almost close to 1,000 miles. The Typhoon was ideal for a trip like this, so light and easy to fly, cruising at 265 kilometers per hour and with a range of about 950 kilometers or about 3.5 hours of flying time. My flight plan was split over 2 days, covering the Czech leg on the first day and staying overnight in Stuttgart. Quite early on the Friday morning I left Zerbst and arrived at Liegnitz at around 10. The staff at the airfield had been advised of my ETA by telephone and everything was ready, working like clockwork. The heavy trunk was strapped down as the aircraft was refueled. Then came the second leg. This was a difficult decision. In order to reach Prague I would have to cross the Riesengebirge, and it was the first time I'd flown in this area. All I knew about it was from fairy tales, where it was the home of gnomes and trolls, the Rübezahl mountain giant and such myths. Evil spirits or not, it could easily become the last resting place of unwary airmen. The line of peaks contained some that topped 1,600 meters, and there was always some cloud cover around, as well as all the other problems of updrafts, downdrafts, the so-called föhn wind and mountain waves. The weather station said that I could have a try and see if I could find a clear valley where I could slip through. The forecasts coming out of the newly occupied Czechoslovakia were still not up to our usual standard, and that was about all they could advise. If it turned out that the mountains were completely closed, I would have to fly around the range more or less back to Dresden and Leipzig and then try to cross the Fichtelgebirge before dropping down to Stuttgart. If this became the case, I would have to take another look at the range and make an intermediate stop for fuel. I had to notify my flight through the Fluko system to Fluglighting at Liegnitz, and they approved my route into Czechoslovakia, which was still a very sensitive area. They did, however, recommend that I remained at an altitude of about 500 meters so that the big white letters WL, which is Wehrmacht Luft, on my Typhoon would be clearly seen. I hoped that would be okay. I really didn't fancy being shot down by a trigger-happy 109 pilot or our own flag. Before noon, the weather improved and I took off and headed for the Riesengebirge in bright sunlight. Instead of the poor conditions which had been previously forecast, I had fantastic visibility. A beautiful view of the mountains and valleys. It was a shame I hadn't thought to bring a camera. Within half an hour I had reached Prague, clearly recognizing the Karlsbrücke and the famous Rachin near the center. I just couldn't resist playing the tourist and flew a complete circuit of the city, taking in the beautiful sights. It was the only time I was ever to see Prague, but I wasn't to know that at the time. I had no radio contact and I wondered what the people on the ground thought of this nice little blue plane circling over their city, sightseeing in the middle of a war. Having done Prague, I set course for the Böhmerwald, and after 2 hours flying over this beautiful area of Germany, I reached the familiar landmarks around Stuttgart and landed at Böblingen. Many interesting things to talk about in this episode, even though Ulrich has been transferred back to Germany for now. But let's talk about his remarks about looting, or the lack thereof, and the entrepreneurial Oberfeldwebel they caught. This guy was very lucky indeed, and even though he was demoted on the spot, that was a far better fate than to be shot by firing squad. Ulrich also mentioned some privately recorded 8mm films, and I was immediately curious about them. Unfortunately, he says that they were all lost later in the war on the Eastern Front. The camera he bought, by the way, was worth the equivalent of about 1,500 euros today. Quite an expensive toy. And now, on to the most important thing. This time, it is German folklore. So, welcome to Spirit Diaries. This is the story of Rübezahl. Ulrich mentions Rübezahl during his flight planning across Poland and Czechoslovakia and the Riesengebirge. Now, Riesengebirge literally means the giant mountains, and that is where Rübezahl lives. Rübezahl is a shape-shifting mountain spirit that usually takes on the form of a tall old man. He is the guardian of the mountain range and apparently very capricious. The story goes that because he is so large and scary, people avoid him, so at some point, of course, he kidnaps a fair maiden for company. The girl goes along with this for a while, but at some point complains about being lonely as well. So Rübezahl shapeshifts some turnips from his field into small people for the girl to have company and talk to. However, the magical people age extremely fast, just as turnips wither, and they die in regular intervals. So Rübezahl has to create a new batch of them on the regular as well. Oh, by the way, in case you didn't know, European, especially German and Polish folk tales are pretty hardcore. Anyway, at some point the girl has had enough and employs a ruse. She asks Rübezahl how many turnips there are left in his field in total, and if he can give her the exact number, she will marry him. Rübezahl then turns away and starts counting the turnips to give her an exact number. Afterwards, he counts again and comes to a different count, which puzzles him. Wanting to be sure, he goes on for a third time. The girl uses the opportunity to escape and deride the spirit while doing so. And that is how he got his name, as Rübezahl directly translates to turnip counter. Today, Rübezahl is said to reside in the forests and mountain ranges in that same area and harass or guide hikers and passers-by, depending on his mood. Should you ever encounter him, be warned, Rübezahl is a derogatory name which may anger him. Instead, address him by his correct name, which is Lord of the Mountain or Lord John. He may actually lead you towards treasure in this case. He is also said to be an extremely good judge of character and may appear as an old lady or monk asking for help. In that case, choose wisely. So, if you've made it this far, thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Cheers.